Story: The Last Porch Light. When Margaret Whittaker stepped off the bus in the fading light of early autumn, the wind caught the edge of her scarf and fluttered it like a ribbon on a gift. She held it down with one gloved hand, clutching her purse with the other, and looked around the sleepy town of Glenmere, Pennsylvania, a place she had left behind nearly 4 decades ago. It hadn't changed much. The trees still lined Main Street in neat rows, their branches bowing slightly with the weight of golden leaves. The lampposts still bore the same wrought iron bases, and the benches in front of Hardy's Pharmacy looked exactly like they did in 1962, when she'd sat there with Alan, legs touching just barely, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret breathed in deeply. The air here smelled different, clean, slightly sweet, with the perfume of wood smoke and distant apples. It was the kind of air that made you think of pies cooling on windowsills and quilts folded at the ends of beds. She adjusted her coat and began walking toward the house she hadn't seen in over 40 years. The house with the wraparound porch, the blue shutters, and the porch light that Alan had always insisted they leave on at night. In the years after he died, Margaret had sold the house, moved to the city, and buried herself in work. She taught school for 30 more years, never remarried, rarely returned. But now, in her 75th year, with nothing tethering her to Boston but dusty photo albums and well-meaning neighbors, she had made the decision to come back. The house, now hers again after the passing of its last tenant, waited. She turned down Sycamore Lane. The street was quieter than she remembered. The children who used to play kickball in the evening were grown now, with children of their own. Many houses were dim, their porches empty. Still, some things hadn't changed. And then there it was, the Whittaker house. Its porch sagged slightly on one side, and the shutters could use a coat of paint. But it was hers, still standing, still solid. Margaret paused at the gate. Her hand trembled slightly as she unlatched it, the old metal creaking in protest. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old cedar. The furniture she'd stored was still under white sheets, like ghosts caught mid-dance. The hardwood floors creaked familiarly beneath her feet. She touched the edge of the mantel, running her hand along the carved initials, A and M, barely visible now. That first night, she unpacked only the essentials. A kettle, a cup, one photograph of Alan in his Navy uniform, grinning like he always did. She set it on the bedside table and turned on the porch light before crawling under the covers. The next morning, sunlight streamed in through lace curtains. She made herself tea and stood at the kitchen window, watching the street. Around mid-morning, a knock came at the door. Margaret hesitated before opening it. A woman stood there, maybe in her 60s, with short silver hair and a wide smile. She held a basket covered in a red cloth. "Hello," she said. "You must be Margaret Whittaker." Margaret blinked. I'm Helen Godfrey. I live 2 houses down. My husband and I have been watching the place, hoping someone would move in and not let it fall apart completely." She extended the basket. "Apple bread. My own recipe." Margaret smiled softly and stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" Helen stepped inside and looked around with a kind of reverence, her eyes scanning the framed photos on the wall and the worn edge of the banister. "It's like stepping back in time," she said softly. "My mother used to talk about your husband. Said he was the kindest man she ever met. Fixed our mailbox when I was 10. Margaret felt a flutter in her chest, somewhere between ache and warmth. "He liked helping people," she said. "Didn't matter if he knew you 5 minutes or 5 years." They sat at the kitchen table, the apple bread between them, sliced and steaming. Margaret hadn't realized how much she missed the simple act of sharing a table with someone. Helen sipped her tea. "You staying for good?" Margaret looked down at her hands, at the faint blue veins beneath the skin. "I think so. I don't have much reason to be anywhere else." Helen gave a knowing nod. Well, if you ever need anything, tools, groceries, someone to talk to, I'm just 2 houses over. After Helen left, Margaret spent the afternoon uncovering furniture and sweeping out dust. Each room held pieces of her memory. The parlor where Alan had proposed, the back porch where they'd watched summer storms roll in, the upstairs bedroom with the slanted ceiling they used to laugh about hitting their heads on. That night, she lit the porch light again. Days passed, then weeks. Margaret settled into a rhythm. Morning walks through the neighborhood, grocery trips into town, evening tea on the porch with a blanket over her knees. She started talking to the neighbors. Not many were left from her time, but their children remembered her. They brought over casseroles and gossip. And slowly, Glenmere began to feel less like a place of ghosts and more like a town still living. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I still remember the way you danced in the kitchen. Hey, Margaret stared at it for a long time. Alan used to leave her notes like that. Little scraps of paper tucked into coat pockets or wedged between books on the shelf. But this wasn't his handwriting. Still, it sent a chill through her, not of fear, but of something old and tender stirring awake. The next day, another letter came. The light in the window meant you were home. It still does. Margaret didn't tell anyone. Not at first. She wasn't frightened, just unsettled. Curious. She kept the letters in the drawer by the bed, beside Alan's photo. She began checking the mailbox with a small flicker of anticipation, like a girl waiting for word from a faraway pen pal. Then, one evening in late October, just as the leaves turned fire red and the air grew crisp enough to sting her cheeks, Margaret saw him. An old man, on the sidewalk across the street. Just standing. He wore a brown wool coat and a gray cap pulled low. When their eyes met, he gave the smallest of nods before walking away. She stood on the porch long after he disappeared, heart tapping an unfamiliar rhythm. The following week, she received another note. You don't know me, but I knew you. Years ago. I've carried that memory like a stone in my pocket. Heavy but warm. She read it again and again, wondering. Was it a former student? A neighbor? Someone who had once passed through her life like a shadow and never forgotten? Then came a knock at the door. Not in the morning. At night, just after she turned on the porch light. She opened it slowly. It was him, the man from the sidewalk. Up close, she saw the deep lines around his eyes, the slow way he removed his cap. I'm sorry to come so late, he said. My name is Arthur Lane. The name meant nothing to her. I lived on Franklin Street, he continued. Just a few blocks over. I saw you once, dancing in your kitchen. I must have been 15. Margaret blinked. That was 60 years ago. He smiled. And I never forgot it. They stood in silence. Two old souls framed by warm porch light and the scent of fallen leaves. Would you like some tea? She asked finally. Arthur nodded. I would. They sat in the same kitchen where she'd once poured tea for Alan, the same chipped teapot between them. They talked until the grandfather clock struck 10. He told her he'd never married, that he left Glenmere at 18, worked in shipyards, then as a mailman in Vermont, that he came back after his sister passed to settle her affairs and decided to stay. I walk every evening, he said, and when I saw the porch light was on again, felt like something had returned. Margaret looked at him, really looked. He was not Alan. He was not a substitute, but he was kind, thoughtful, quiet in a way that didn't require filling space with words. That night, after he left, she wrote her first letter. I remember you now. You were the boy who used to run past our hedge, always late for something. I hope you're not late for this. Arthur began visiting once a week, sometimes twice, always after sunset, always when the porch light was on. They didn't talk about love, not in the way young people do, with declarations and drama. Instead, they spoke of gardens, of old music, of quiet regrets and small joys. He helped fix the broken porch rail. She showed him how to make her mother's pear preserves. They shared crosswords, played Scrabble with worn wooden tiles, and sometimes just sat in silence while the radio hummed softly from the parlor. Autumn bled into winter. The trees turned skeletal, the wind sharper, the sky more often gray than blue. But Margaret no longer minded. The house felt alive again, and she, too, began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: anticipation. Then, just before Christmas, she got sick. It started as a cough. Then came the fever and the bone-deep weariness. Helen stopped by and insisted she see a doctor. Margaret resisted at first, old habits, stubborn pride, but eventually gave in. It was pneumonia. They caught it early, but the doctor warned her to rest, to stay warm, to eat. Arthur brought soup every evening, staying only long enough to ensure she drank it. He didn't press. He didn't hover. He simply showed up. One night, Margaret found a letter beside the teacup. You don't need to be strong all the time. You've held up a world. Let someone else carry it for a while. She cried when she read it. Not out of sadness, but out of the deep relief of being seen, really seen, in her vulnerability. By January, she was better. The color returned to her cheeks. Her steps grew steadier. She resumed her walks, short at first, then longer. The cold no longer bit so hard. And Arthur, ever patient, returned to their old rhythm. Always the porch light, always tea, always something gentle and unspoken between them. One evening in late February, she asked him, "Why didn't you ever marry?" Arthur looked down at his hands. "I didn't know how to let someone close without losing myself. And when I finally met someone who made me want to try, I was too late." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. It was rough, warm, trembling slightly like her own. "You're not too late," she said. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Neither are you." They didn't kiss. Not that night. But something passed between them, quiet, sacred. Spring came reluctantly that year, in fits and starts. The robins returned. Crocuses pushed through the earth. Margaret opened the windows again, let the fresh air sweep through the rooms. She began planting herbs on the kitchen sill, her fingers working the soil with reverence. And Arthur was there, every week, sometimes with a book, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with nothing but his presence. On her 76th birthday, he brought a record player, a real one with polished wood sides and a small stack of jazz records from the 50s. "This one," he said, placing the needle, "always reminded me of you." The music began, slow, smoky, soft like a whisper in the dark. Margaret stood, her bones stiff but her spirit light. Arthur offered his hand, and they danced. Not like young lovers, not with fiery passion or sweeping movements, but with grace, with knowing, with all the weight and beauty of years lived and lost and lived again. The kitchen disappeared. The years peeled away. She was 30 again, then 20, then 17. And when the song ended, they simply stood there, forehead to forehead, the record player crackling softly in the background. "I wish Alan could see this," she whispered. Arthur nodded. "I think he does." That night, as she turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, she felt something in her chest. Not pain, not fear, but fullness. The swelling of something like peace. Like coming home. In May, Arthur asked if she would accompany him to the town spring fair. It was the first time in years she'd even considered going. But she said yes. They walked arm in arm through the town square, past booths selling pies and homemade soaps, past children with balloons and teenagers playing folk songs on old guitars. People greeted her by name. They smiled. They remembered. She wasn't a ghost here anymore. And when the sun set behind the hills and the lanterns began to glow, Arthur turned to her and said, "I've waited 60 years to walk beside you like this." Margaret looked at him, eyes shining. "And I've waited all this time to say I'm glad you found me." She held his hand tightly as they walked home. And that night, for the first time since Alan had passed, she didn't feel alone. She turned off the porch light before bed, not because no one was coming, but because everyone she needed was already there. Story 2 Letters from Franklin Street. The box was old, the cardboard soft from decades of moisture and time. It had been sealed with yellowing tape and tucked away in the back corner of his mother's attic, behind Christmas ornaments and forgotten luggage, behind a quilt that still faintly smelled like lavender. Tom Barrett found it on a Saturday morning in March. He hadn't expected much from the attic. His mother had passed 2 weeks prior at the age of 94, and he'd come to her house on Franklin Street to begin the long process of sorting, packing, and saying goodbye. He was 65, recently retired, and more alone than he liked to admit. His kids were grown and scattered across the country. His wife had left 3 years ago. Not for another man, but for a quieter life she claimed she couldn't find with him. He didn't argue. He simply let her go. But now, standing in the dusty beam of light filtering through the attic window, Tom felt something stir when he touched the box. It had his name on it. Just Tom, written in his mother's delicate script, the same one she used on every birthday card since he was a boy. He sat down cross-legged, knees cracking, and pulled the tape away. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Elizabeth Barrett, his mother's maiden name, and postmarked between 1942 and 1946. Each envelope was carefully opened, the paper inside yellowed but legible. He picked one at random and unfolded it. June 18th, 1943. My dearest Lizzie, today the rain came down so hard it beat the red dust into mud. The trucks got stuck. The tents leaked. But even soaked to the skin, I found myself smiling. Because in my breast pocket, I carry your last letter. And every time I read it, I feel warm, even in this godforsaken heat. You asked what I miss most. It's your laugh. The way it starts quiet and then explodes like a match to dry pine. I hear it sometimes when I close my eyes. It reminds me why I'm here, why I keep going. Yours always, James. Tom read the letter 3 times before he folded it again. The handwriting was strong, the words tender. He had never heard of a James. His mother had never spoken of anyone by that name. He kept reading. Letter after letter, all signed James. All filled with longing, poetry, and quiet desperation. Sometimes he wrote from the Pacific, other times from Europe. His unit seemed to move often, and he spoke little of battle, but much of home, of her. And then Tom found it, a photograph, black and white, creased in the corners. A young man in uniform, tall and serious-eyed, standing in front of a train station. On the back, in fading ink, James R. Collier, 1944. The name didn't ring any bells. Tom's father, Richard Barrett, had died in 1997. He'd been a good man, quite a watchmaker by trade. He and Elizabeth had been married for 50 years, but she never mentioned anyone named James. never spoke of another man, another love. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table of the house he'd grown up in, the letters spread before him like leaves fallen from a tree he'd never seen. Who was James? Why had she kept his letters? And why had she never said a word? The next morning, Tom called his cousin Grace. She was a decade older, his mother's niece, and had a memory like a steel trap. "James Collier," she said over the phone. "Of course I remember him." "You do?" "Oh, yes. He was sweet on your mother before the war." Everyone knew. They were inseparable that summer of 42. We all thought they'd marry. Then he enlisted, and, well, he never came back. Tom felt something in his throat tighten. "You mean he died?" "No," Grace said. "I mean he never came back. Letters stopped. Your mother cried for weeks. Then, a year later, she met Richard. They married in 45, and that was that. But she kept the letters." "She did." Grace sounded surprised, then quieter. She must have really loved him. Tom thanked her and hung up. For the next week, he read every single letter. They told a story not of war, but of hope. Of a man who dreamed of returning, of planting apple trees, of building a porch swing, of dancing in the kitchen and watching stars from a back lawn, of simple things. Then the letters stopped in 1946. No explanation, no final goodbye, just silence. Tom couldn't let it go. The mystery clung to him. He became obsessed, the way some men become obsessed with golf or Civil War trivia. He looked up enlistment records. He searched online archives. He found a James Robert Collier, born 1921 in Pennsylvania, enlisted in 42, served in the 3rd Infantry Division, and to his astonishment, died in 1988 in Ohio. Tom stared at the screen. He didn't die in the war. James had lived 40 more years, had survived, had come home, just not to Franklin Street. He dug deeper. Obituaries, census records, phone books. He found a daughter, Margaret Collier, living in Akron. His hands shook as he dialed the number. A woman answered. Her voice was warm but cautious. "Yes, James Collier was my father," she said. "He died when I was 34. Why do you ask?" Tom took a breath. "He wrote letters to my mother during the war. Dozens. I just found them. I think they loved each other once." There was silence on the other end. Then, softly, he never talked about the war, or about anyone named Elizabeth. But he kept a box. We weren't allowed to touch it. Tom swallowed. What was in it? I don't know. After he died, my mother threw it away. She was angry. Said she'd always been second in his heart. Tom closed his eyes. She had loved someone else. So had James. And for reasons neither side ever knew, they'd never found their way back. Over the following days, Tom couldn't get the story out of his mind. He wandered through his mother's house, touching things she had touched, imagining her young self waiting, hoping, and then moving on. What must it have felt like to hold those letters, to clutch memories of a man who had promised forever and then disappeared from her life? He began writing down everything he could remember about his mother, the laugh lines around her eyes, the way she folded laundry, the faint perfume she wore. He wished he could ask her why she'd never told him about James. If it was shame or pain, or simply a story too complicated for words. He also wanted to meet Margaret Collier. The next week, he arranged to drive to Akron. When they met, Margaret was waiting on her porch, a woman with gentle eyes and silver-streaked hair. She held out her hand, and Tom felt an immediate connection, like they were two threads of the same tapestry, torn apart and sewn back together. They talked for hours, sharing fragments of their father's lives, and slowly, a picture emerged. Two young lovers caught in a war that swallowed everything whole. Two hearts that had tried to be together but were pulled apart by fate and circumstance. Margaret showed him a faded photograph of James with a young woman. Not Elizabeth, but someone else, a second love from after the war. He married her after he left Franklin Street, Margaret said softly. But he never stopped thinking about Mom. Tom nodded. She kept every letter. Margaret smiled sadly. And he kept a box. I never knew what was inside. They sat in silence, the weight of years and lost love filling the quiet air. Before leaving, Tom handed Margaret a small envelope. "It's from my mother," he said. "A letter I found. For you." Margaret opened it carefully. "Dear Margaret, I never told you about James. But I want you to know that you were loved by both of us. I hope you can forgive the silence between us. With love, Elizabeth." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I think they both loved each other more than we realized. Tom reached over and squeezed her hand. "Maybe," he said, "we can help finish the story." Outside, the sun was setting over Franklin Street, casting a warm golden glow over the old houses and leafy trees. For the first time in decades, Tom felt the past and present blend together, not as ghosts or regrets, but as stories waiting to be told. He looked down at the letters once more and smiled. Because some loves, no matter how long lost, never truly fade.
Thanks for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe.